Recycling is an inherent part of developing an expansion. In fact, it's probably the most fundamental aspect of an expansion. They are more of the same. But it's the moment-to-moment gameplay that should be recycled rather than the iconic set pieces. To take an analogy from the film world, Terminator 2, and granted it's a sequel but whatever, has the same basic structure as the Terminator. They're both chase films with a good guy running away from a bad guy from the future, while a good guy, who is also from the future, tries to stop the bad guy. Fundamentally the same. But those special moments, the ones that everyone remembers, you won't find them in both films. Sarah Connor doesn't have sex with the Terminator in T2, and the truck/motorbike sequence from T2 isn't to be found anywhere in the Terminator. And now let's look at Half-Life 2. What is the game's basic structure? What is the moment-to-moment gameplay? I mean, one moment you're unarmed, running away from the transhuman police force, the next you're screaming down a motorway in a car, the next you're leading a squad of giant insect monsters through a prison. So, what is the moment-to-moment gameplay, when every 30 or 60 or whatever minutes you're doing something fundamentally different to what preceded it and to what will follow it? The answer, at least my answer, is that Half-Life 2's iconic set pieces are its moment-to-moment gameplay. The lack of structure is in fact the structure itself. What I mean by that is that the defining characteristic of the game is that the entire game is constantly in a state of flux, with the only constant being that you shoot stuff from a first-person perspective. And that is what I believe should be carried over to Half-Life 2's expansions. And indeed, it is. Every single chapter of each of Half-Life 2's expansions is either slightly or completely different to what came before and to what comes after. Both expansions are constantly changing. So that's Half-Life 2's moment-to-moment gameplay carried over, which is my first criterion for what constitutes a successful expansion. The second criterion is what shouldn't be carried over, the specific content of these set pieces. Set pieces like, for example, the turret defense against the antlions. That is straight out of Half-Life 2, except it was Combine instead of antlions in Half-Life 2. Now, granted, this Episode 2 set piece is actually pretty great, and I'd even go as far as to say the Doppelganger is actually better than the Half-Life 2 original. But nevertheless, as good as it is, I just felt like I had done it before, because I had done it before in Half-Life 2. What also dampens this sequence is that it comes in the middle of approximately 70 minutes of walking through a fucking cave. Half-Life 2's level design, even though it's totally linear, always held a very convincing feel, compared to, say, Fear's corridors with 7 out of 8 doors being locked. Half-Life 2's linearity never felt forced. In fact, it didn't even feel apparent. Everything felt so natural and everything flowed together so seamlessly that I was never consciously aware that I was being led through a linear environment. It's not something I brought up in my Half-Life 2 review, but the level design really is something special. Episode 2, on the other hand, well, an entire quarter of Episode 2 is walking through this cave. Not only is there only ever one way to go, these caves don't even give the illusion that there are other things happening in the environment, because it's a fucking cave. And this would be okay if Half-Life 2 had combat as good as Fear, but it doesn't. The entire sequence is a very bland, very by the numbers, A to B, run and gun turkey shoot. A new enemy is introduced here, a variant of the antlion, that seems to have a rocket launcher for a bottom. It has good range, and its projectiles do splash damage, so combined with the in-your-face regular antlions, combat could have been pretty hectic, but it never really advances to that stage, because there are so few enemies. Surely if any lesson was learned in Episode 1, it's that more equals better. Sadly that's not the case, and even this could be forgiven. But this cave sequence spans about a quarter of the entire episode. As far as level design goes, this is the laziest Valve has ever been. There is an original chase sequence involving a guardian antlion, but the linearity and the predictability is really taken to its extreme in this sequence. It's a run from one health-filled safe hole to the next type thing. And even though the antlion can take off a significant amount of your health every time it hits you, there's no sense of danger at all. It's an especial shame as there's some pretty good foreshadowing to get you in the mood for the sequence. And then there are set pieces like driving the car. I can imagine Half-Life 2's design document being copied verbatim for Episode 2's driving section. Besides Alex being with you, she's with you for most of the game, it's just the exact same thing done again. The exact same set piece. Why not take the idea of the vehicle section and do something new with it, like a flying vehicle? We've seen land and water. Why not try air this time around? It's not technologically prohibitive, but no. They went for driving around peppered with firefights. Yet again. Granted, some of these firefights are pretty good. One in particular. I won't divulge the details, except to say that it felt like a sequence that relies on its unpredictability, but you really can see it coming a mile away. One new enemy is introduced in this general area, the Hunter. It's a quick-moving, powerful, three-legged creature that fires pellets that hurt, but also explode after a few seconds. It has a distinctly animal personality, possibly resembling a dog, but I'm not really sure. They provide some pretty intense firefights, as the whole area around you is exploding and you're running around like a headless chicken trying to avoid it. But the concept is better in principle than in practice, because Half-Life 2 is so frustratingly easy. And then there are set pieces like having to construct makeshift bridges across impassable terrain. In Half-Life 2, this sequence was of course used in the antlion area. Stepping on the sand would cause them to burrow up and attack you. In Episode 2, you've got toxic materials and you drop things in to make yourself a little bridge across, while zombies and zombines come at you. Again, it's a complete rehash of something in Half-Life 2, except worse. The one cool thing that puts a little twist on it is that the stuff you're standing on slowly sinks, which puts a ticking clock on your activities. But again, Half-Life 2 is so easy that it doesn't really matter. On normal difficulty, you can actually just run through the toxic sludge without much risk. There's never a health pack or 10 far away. There are some original set pieces though, like one where you have to stay out of the crosshairs of a very powerful enemy weapon, which mostly involves crouching behind cover, snaking your way closer and closer. It's original, but it's stale, and it feels just about as contrived as the opening cave sequence. The final sequence is probably the best part of the game, and is actually probably the best ending sequence in any Half-Life game to date. But between Half-Life's giant fetus and Half-Life 2's jumping on stuff, it's not exactly up against stiff competition, but nevertheless, it is a very solid end sequence. And I realise that I'm 1300 words in and haven't actually mentioned the story yet. That's because there isn't one. Episode 2 pretty much serves as a counterpoint to Episode 1, where 1 was get out of City 17, 2 is get to the White Forest. We learn a little more about the big fat controllers known as advisors, and there's an interesting insight into the G-Man's manipulation of other people, but there's really no meat on these bones. Just like Episode 1, there isn't a story being told here. It's the flimsiest of scenarios, and again, just like Episode 1, it lacks all of the nuance and texture of Half-Life 2. Just about everything else is in line with Valve's standards, which are exceptionally high. The writing, what little there is sharp and funny when it wants to be. Music is used sparsely, but when it is used, it greatly enhances the atmosphere of the scene. The voice acting is fantastic, and we actually get to spend an extended period of time with the Vorsagons. While the particular sequence is kind of crappy, his regular comments do offer some small salvation. Visually, it's really showing its age now, with things like the grass texture, which is kind of just flat green lines, stands out as particularly bad. But this is an observation more than a criticism, because it really does look as good as it needs to look. I'm too lazy to check, but I believe dynamic shadows cast by Freeman's torch is a new, and heretofore surprisingly absent, technological element of the Source engine. Playing Episode 2, I wonder if Valve understands what an expansion is actually meant to be. After all, they've only made 2, and they're both pretty damn poor. I would strongly recommend everyone who disagrees with this review, which is probably everyone, plays Fear Extraction Point and Crisis Warhead. Both games take the moment-to-moment gameplay of their parents, expand on it, and provide new and interesting experiences. Both games are shorter, better versions of their parents. Half-Life 2 Episode 2 is a shorter, rubbisher version of Half-Life 2. I wouldn't go as far as to call it awful, but like Episode 1, the only thing it has left me wanting is to forget about it.